Hey everyone, it's Todd from Guild Games here with another devlog, part 2 of Shrouded Aspect. Now in the original devlog in the last episode I talked about the original design ideas and how we came up with that stuff. So I'm going to move in a little bit further, still talking about the old original design, because remember this goes all the way back to 2007. I have a timeline here that, a lot of this is going by memory. Some of it I was able to actually find emails or files with date stamps on it to try to put things in place, and then I knew other things I could have to interpolate in between. In 2007, February, March, like I mentioned in the last episode, the design and story, Miles Wool and I sat down for a week, came up with the overall general design for what this game was going to be. It's going to be a turn-based combat game in a fantasy world with a story that drives the scenarios. Gave the story to my friend Charity Becker. She wrote the script. And then I started the project in Blitz3D shortly after that, somewhere around April or May of 2007. Now Blitz3D is a gaming programming language that used to be really big back in those days. That's what I used for the original Shady O'Grady's Rising Star, which had just come out right about this time. So I was starting my next project in Blitz3D as well. So luckily I have screenshots, a series of screenshots from 2007 and 2008 that are actually dated. So this really helps a lot to show what kind of progress was made during that time in Blitz3D. In June, they got the terrain set up, and you could select characters, and I created basic spell effects. You can see in the screenshot though that the characters are just primitive shapes. I just had like a cone pointing in the direction that the character was facing. Didn't look like people at all, just placeholder stuff. I mainly want to get some the ability to aim and show like fireballs being shot and explosions and things like that. In August, I added the UI for combat. You can see at the bottom of the screen, and some trees, and you'll kind of see throughout this whole thing that little by little more things are added to the scenarios. I also added a hex grid overlay so you can see that where the characters can stand and move and everything. September, the first scenario designs really started to take shape. I wanted it to start at this farmhouse with a couple of brothers and a wolf. We still don't have the characters for those particular characters from the story, but the scenario of where it's going to take place is starting to come together with the house and a really domesticated looking place. In October, I started adding the tile highlighting, so you can choose which spots you want to place your characters at the start of a scenario, and also when you're aiming skills, like if you want to, in this particular screenshot, is aiming a fireball, like where the green shows where you can click and with line of sight included, and the orangish shows the area of effect that it'll hit when it lands, or when it shoots and explodes. Also, when people take damage, when characters take damage, the amount of damage in red appears above them. It kind of floats up. In December, I added the ability to hold weapons and shields, so the characters can now walk around, and there's some new character models, and as they animate, the shields and swords and everything animate with them. So that was really, really cool looking. Added a wolf model for those initial characters, like I said, two brothers and a wolf. And I created a skill editor app, and this was actually part of the main program itself. So it was all done within the program at a special hotkey or something I could press and bring up the skill editor, and it was pretty cool because then I could define a lot of complex things about how the skills worked. Then in 2008, around February, I added a UI for the scenario staging. This is where The scenario description is shown to you, and all of the characters you have to choose from, and choose which ones you want to take into the scenario. Pathfinding was added for the characters. I also did, somewhere around this time, database connectivity, so I could save and load games. And those save games at that point were all saved in a SQLite 3 database. I think it's SQLite 3 or maybe just SQLite. I don't remember now. But all that was working. And in March, I added some more character spell effects. So like if somebody catches on fire, they look like they're on fire, for example. If they're frozen, you'll see like snowflakes coming off them. They turn blue. Character info UI, so you can look at all the information about a character, all their aptitudes, their skills, what weapons and armor and shield they have. And also another visual effect, ground scorching, which is an example of like if you shoot a fireball or something explodes and the ground in that area looks like an explosion happened there. So it's just a cool thing. In April, I added some skeleton creature models. So the first scenario is starting to come together because I knew that we wanted to fight against skeletons in the first scenario. A really easy introductory combat that you can't really lose. It just kind of teaches you the mechanics of how to play the game. In May, added the main menu UI, so you can actually start a new game from there, load and save, and the world map UI, so you can see where the different hubs are as you progress through the world, and kilts as a clothing thing for some of the characters. Since it's a Celtic themed game, it makes sense to have some kilts. In June, started working on another scenario design. This time it was the haunted docks. So there's a dock next to some water, and this one adds zombies as another creature model. So now we have skeletons and zombies. In July of 2008, I realized that there's just too many characters and too many animations required to complete this game with like the 30-something scenarios that were planned. So I put the project on hold because I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it at this point. And I worked on some other things, which honestly I don't remember at this point what I was working on. But I do know that in March of 2009, I decided to buy a MacBook laptop, my first Mac that I owned at home, mainly because, and actually I bought it on my birthday, so it was a happy birthday to me, March 9th, 2009. Mainly because I was seeing what people were starting to do with iPhone apps. iPhone was a pretty new thing, and it was starting to really take off with the App Store. So I bought one just to mess around with it. And between March and October, basically I ended up coming up with the first version of Stranded Without a Phone for iPhone. And that was... that did really well initially, and then for the next couple months, and I thought, wow, maybe I should port Shrouded Aspect to iPhone, since people don't expect the same level of graphic quality and stuff like that on a phone as they do on a computer, and I'd be able to get away with characters that are like paper dolls that slide around instead of having fully animated creatures and characters. So in January, that's what I started doing. January of 2010, I started working on porting Shrouded Aspect to iPhone. At this point, Shrouded Aspect had most of the main features there. It just didn't have the scenario designed, it didn't have all the creatures designed, all the skills designed, but the core loop was just about there. And in February, I added the post-combat loot mode, so that after you finish the scenario, you get to look at all the loot that you found on all the monsters that you killed, and that completed the core loop. This is a good time to talk about the core loop. I love watching this video series on YouTube. Tim Kaine Kanon Games has a YouTube channel that I really love to watch. He's a super chill dude. He's been in the game industry for over 40 years, he said. And he was one of the original developers of the original Fallout game. So he has a lot of followers. And he's very interesting to listen to. I find myself pretty much agreeing with everything he says. Everything makes sense that he says. And so I tend to watch it. Recently, he had a video talking about the core game loop. And it's a really good video and everything. But there's a couple of points that I think he kind of misses. One is, why is it called the core game loop? And the reason is because if you look at it visually, what's going on here, the things that players do, what they're doing is they're doing the same thing over and over again in a general sequence that repeats itself and repeats itself. And every time it repeats itself, that's progression in the game. And that's what Tim doesn't mention. A core loop provides a way for characters to progress in the game. And so he does mention, if the core loop is too big or complex, then a game is going to be harder, and it's harder to develop the game, harder to understand how to play the game. So a smaller core loop is easier to play and easier to develop. And but it's not the only it's called the core game loop because that's the main thing that most people do most of the time, which is what Tim says. But there can be other game loops in your game. So I also have this, I don't even know what you would call it, a broad game loop or a general game loop, overall game loop. If the core game loop is just playing a scenario, improving your characters after you finish the scenario, and then starting over, doing another scenario, and so on. This broader game loop shows storyline progression, then play some scenarios to improve your characters and progress, and then move on to the next area in the game, which is called a hub. In this game, I call them hubs. Each hub has multiple scenarios that you have to complete before you can move on to the next hub. So that's kind of a bigger, wider game loop. I was moving along pretty well on this, and I was feeling pretty good about it. I felt I had about 3 or 4 months before I was finished with the game. I figured I could, because the game was mostly done other than like level design and stuff like I said. So the porting was going well. I figured I had about 3 or 4 months. And then I met Chuck Hess. He was, this was a really a critical moment in, well, really my future in game development. Chuck, he had just released another iOS game independently. He kind of had the same idea as me. He bought a iMac or whatever, or not iMac. Maybe he did have an iMac. I don't know what he had. But he made a game called Slide. Little casual game, slide a puzzle pieces around to so they're like scrambled at first, then you have to form the picture. And a friend of ours that was kind of a common or a mutual associate, a guy I worked with at Plexus, knew him and said, "Hey, he just came out with a game. You just came out with a game, or you're working on a game." I just come out with Stranded Without a Phone several months before that, so you should review each other's games. And so we started talking to each other, and we got along really well. And I said, "Hey, we should work on a game together." I think actually maybe he said that to me. We should work on a game together. And I said, yes, but I'm working on a game right now that has about 3 months, I'm estimating, worth of work left. If you want to help me finish that one, then together we can come up with a new idea for a game after that. Okay, so he jumped on board to help me finish Shrouded Aspect. And I quit my day job at Plexus in April to work full-time on Shrouded Aspect with Chuck. Now, this was also really a unique situation that I'd never come across before, because I never met anybody that first of all, was a game developer, seriously, and also had the freedom to not have to work a day job to support himself while he worked on making games on the side or something like that. So, Chuck had done some other businesses before this. He ran I don't know for sure. So Chuck, correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but he ran like a web design company or something like that, and had Kellogg as one of the big clients. He ran Big Guys Pinball. He made Pinball 2000 with another guy or two as partners doing that stuff. So he was really involved in the pinball scene and arcade scene and other things. So he had the financial freedom to be able to focus on this with me full time, which was awesome, because that's really hard to find even now. So for the rest of the year, really, I mainly focused on creating editors, a skill editor, a creature designer, which is, I don't know if a creature designer is the right, character template designer, I guess. So like all the different kind of, whether they're friendly creatures or friendly characters or creatures in the game, they define all their stats and what skills they have and everything. The skill designer, like I said, I made a map editor as well, which unfortunately I couldn't get it to run on a modern computer with Windows 11, so I couldn't show you that. But that was written in Microsoft XNA framework back in this time. So unfortunately, they discontinued XNA several years ago, and it just doesn't work. I don't know if I can find an old computer and bring it up, get it working someday. But so the entity types editor was basically to define all of the different things that can go on the map in the map editor. So whether it's rocks, trees, grass, mushrooms, flowers, bridges, houses, walls, any of that kind of stuff. So I was able to get those editors to run, so you can see them here. And those were just written in C#, Visual Studio, C#. So they still run. No XNA, I guess. So while I was working on that stuff, and especially after I got the map editor done, Chuck started using the map editor, and he really ran with it. He designed probably 75% of the scenarios, and I think there's 32 scenarios, something like that. And I had ideas for a couple of specific ones. Like earlier I said, like the first scenario, you start out with the farmhouse and the two brothers and the wolf and the skeletons, and then that other one with the haunted docks and the zombies and stuff, and maybe one or two other specific ones that I wanted to do. And Chuck really just filled in everything else. Especially he was really into he did the AI logic for all of the monsters. I did the general AI, like, that the monster code could say, like, hey, find me the nearest enemy. And then I would write the code that would find the nearest enemy, but then the monster AI would use that code to find the nearest enemy and decide what to do with that information. And Chuck wrote a lot of that stuff, most of that stuff. And he was really into making interesting kind of boss fights, I guess. So we ended up having like a boss fight that you needed to do before you progress to the next hub, which is part of that broader game loop that I showed earlier. And he wanted to make them, kind of like little puzzles, like there's certain ways that are easiest to beat these things, but it wasn't obvious at first. And of course they start out easier, and by the end of the game they're really tough. And that was pretty cool. What he did was, my original vision for these scenarios was each one would take about 15 or 20 minutes. It would basically be, each scenario would be one combat. And instead what Chuck did was, the map was big enough where he was able to sometimes put 3, 4, 5 different combat encounters within the same map. You start in one part of it, do the combat, progress along somewhere within the map, come across another thing, another encounter, do that one, progress along the map, and keep going. Also added the idea of finding treasure chests. We just put treasure chests in different parts of the map that nothing else was necessarily there. They were optional. Sometimes there might be another creature or a tougher creature or something guarding the treasure chest, but wasn't required to finish the scenario. But if you wanted to explore and look for treasure, you could. So definitely, all that stuff added a lot of scope to the game. In what I thought was going to be 3 or 4 months to finish the game ended up being 9 months. But it was a much better game. There was just so much more content, and it came out really good. Also, during this time, toward the end of it, Chuck and I did voiceover recording, and I also hired a young lady named Samantha Avery, who I worked with on a couple of 48-hour film challenges just for fun on the side, who I knew from Detroit. And she came over to Kalamazoo, to Chuck's house where he has a home studio in the basement, and we recorded some voice work with Samantha. She doesn't do the main narration of the storytelling. That was done by Miss Cupcake, was her online name years ago. I don't think she does anything on YouTube anymore, but she used to do a bunch of accents. She's from Australia, and she did a bunch of different accents, and so she did that. But Samantha did all of the some character acting for some of the characters in the game, like the main character really, plus all of the different sounds for when a female's getting hurt, killed, whatever, reacting to things. So that was a lot of fun. I did a lot of the sound design during this time. I probably recorded some of my own sounds, but a lot of it came from sounddogs.com. That's a great resource, really inexpensive way to find a lot of great sounds. That brings us into January of 2011, which was the initial release. We released for the iPhone. 3GS was the current model, I believe, at that time. That's what I had. That's what I was testing on. And I also had the original iPad. And both of these devices, these predated the Retina screen. So that 3GS screen was only I think, if I'm remembering right, something like 640 by 320 resolution, or 480 by 320 or something like that. Really fat pixels. And the iPad was kind of the same pixel density, but I think it was 1024 by 768 because it was a bigger screen. And that really limited, it changed how the UI design had to be done compared to the original computer version, because you couldn't fit as much stuff on the screen. So I had to break it up into different ways, and it changed how the UI interaction worked with when playing the game. It made it a little more clunky to select skills and select targets and move your characters around. In January, right after we released that game, Chuck went and started with this new startup called Spooky Cool Labs, because it was, and he told me, he's like, hey, this is a great opportunity. Larry DeMar and Joe Camico and Brian Eddy and all these kind of arcade and pinball legends started this thing to make social games. He said, this is a great opportunity. It's like, you really got to take it. I'm going. I think you should go too. And I said, well, I'm going to spend some time working on the iPad version of Shrouded Aspect first, and then we'll see how it goes. So I did that, spent a month on that, released it in February, and Shrouded Aspect was just did not sell much at all. It barely made any money whatsoever. So I had to have a backup plan, so I went and joined Spooky Cool Labs as well. And that's the end of the story for the original development of Shrouded Aspect. Now, fast forward to now, and thinking about it and thinking about this game and thinking about it, more and more about all the tools that are available now, the resources, the models, the characters, the animations, and just a lot more people in the game development community. Just everything is so much better, more and better when it comes to game development. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to dust this project off and go back to the original intention, which was to make it a computer game in 3D, except do it in Unity, which I'm very familiar with now, which is one of those tools that are just so much better than what I was working with in Blitz3D at the time. Blitz3D had no visual editor whatsoever. It was all just code. You had to do everything in code. It was kind of old school. You had your main loop that did everything until you told the main loop to stop, and then the game would quit. So it's very different now, porting it into Unity, mainly from the Objective-C iPhone code, because that was more complete than what the Blitz3D version had by the time it was finished. It's a really weird thing to do right now, because the way you structure the code in Unity is so much different than the old school way of having a main loop and drawing everything manually in the order that you want it and everything. It's very different in Unity. So anyway, thanks for tuning in and watching so far. I know this was probably kind of long-winded, but I really wanted to just get past all of this old origin story of the game, so that in future episodes we can talk about what I'm actually working on now in Unity to get this game done.